Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to highlight a moment that showcased India's unwavering confidence on the global stage. At the United Nations, India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, delivered a sharp and dignified response to Turkey's unwarranted remarks on Kashmir and India's internal affairs. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a masterclass in diplomacy, strength, and clarity. His words reminded the world that India will not tolerate interference in its sovereignty and that global politics must be rooted in respect, not hypocrisy. Today, I will walk you through this epic diplomatic takedown that left Turkey and the world thinking twice. Turkey has often tried to interfere in the Kashmir issue, a matter that India has repeatedly declared as purely internal. At the United Nations, Turkish leaders, including President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, have raised the subject of Jammu and Kashmir, questioning India's policies and presenting themselves as the voice of so-called global concern. However, this interference is not based on genuine concern for peace or human rights. It is politically motivated. Turkey has long aligned itself with Pakistan on several international platforms, and its commentary on Kashmir is less about principle and more about solidarity with its ally. By raising Kashmir, Turkey aims to challenge India's growing influence in global affairs, while also trying to project itself as a champion of Muslim causes. What makes this interference problematic is the complete disregard for international norms. The principle of sovereignty and non-interference is one of the cornerstones of global diplomacy. Kashmir is an integral part of India, and the world recognizes that it is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, not a subject for third-party meddling. When Turkey speaks on Kashmir, it not only disrespects India's territorial integrity, but also undermines the very principle of respect for sovereignty that governs relations among nations. Such actions are not only unwelcome, but also expose the double standards of Turkey's foreign policy. Turkey's position becomes even weaker when its own domestic and regional record is taken into account. The country has faced international criticism for its handling of minorities, restrictions on press freedom, and its actions in Cyprus and Syria. Yet, despite these issues, Turkey chooses to single out India, a democratic country that functions under constitutional rule and respects the rights of its people. This selective criticism reveals that Turkey's focus on Kashmir is not about justice or human rights, but about furthering its geopolitical interests and supporting its ally Pakistan. India has always maintained that Kashmir is not up for international debate. It is a matter for India alone, governed by its constitution and protected by its sovereignty. When Turkey ignores this and repeatedly comments on the issue, it damages bilateral relations and places itself in direct opposition to India. Moreover, such interference at the UN stage creates unnecessary friction and distracts from real global challenges such as terrorism, climate change, and development areas where cooperation is needed, not confrontation. In essence, Turkey's remarks on Kashmir are unjustified and politically motivated. They are not rooted in truth, fairness, or respect for international law. Instead, they reflect a strategy to align with Pakistan, gain influence in the Muslim world, and challenge India's rising voice on the global stage. By doing so, Turkey not only harms its credibility, but also strengthens India's case when it responds firmly, making it clear that no outside power has the right to dictate or comment on matters of its sovereignty. When Turkey once again raised the Kashmir issue at the United Nations, many expected India to respond with sharp anger or lengthy justifications. Instead, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar chose a completely different approach, one that displayed calm authority, precision, and diplomatic mastery. His reply was not about aggression or emotional rhetoric. It was about clarity and confidence. This is what made his response so powerful and memorable. In the arena of international diplomacy, the way a message is delivered can be as impactful as the message itself. Jaishankar's tone, his choice of words, and the timing of his statements combined to create what many called an epic takedown. The strength of Jaishankar's reply lay in its restraint. He did not waste words attacking Turkey personally, nor did he resort to defensive explanations. Instead, he calmly stated India's long-standing position that Jammu and Kashmir is an internal matter of India and that no foreign country has the right to interfere. This clarity left no room for doubt, and it reminded the global community that India's position has remained consistent for decades. In a forum where nations often use flowery language or indirect criticisms, Jaishankar's direct and firm statement stood out as a mark of strong leadership. Another element of his response was precision. He highlighted the contradictions in Turkey's stance without engaging in unnecessary argument. By pointing out that those who lecture India on human rights and sovereignty often fail to uphold these values themselves, he exposed Turkey's double standards without ever mentioning them in a confrontational way. This subtle but effective style ensured that India came across as dignified and respectful, while Turkey appeared hypocritical in the eyes of many observers. Diplomacy is about persuasion and perception, and Jaishankar ensured that India's image was strengthened in both. The power of his reply also came from its global resonance. In today's interconnected world, every word spoken at the UN is analyzed by diplomats, media, and citizens across the globe. Jaishankar knew that his response was not just directed at Turkey, but also at the international community. By speaking with calm authority, he reassured allies, sent a warning to detractors, and reinforced India's message that sovereignty is not negotiable. The discipline and professionalism of his words ensured that India's reply was not just another statement but a defining moment in its diplomatic posture. Perhaps the most important takeaway from Jaishankar's response is the lesson in strength without aggression. In an age where loud voices often dominate headlines, his ability to remain composed while firmly defending national interests showed the world that true power lies in confidence, not noise. India's message was heard loud and clear. It does not seek unnecessary confrontation, but it will never compromise on its sovereignty. This balance between firmness and dignity is what made Jaishankar's reply a masterclass in diplomacy, and it is why his words are remembered as an epic takedown of Turkey at the UN. When India responded to Turkey's remarks on Kashmir at the United Nations, one of the most striking aspects was how it exposed Turkey's hypocrisy. Turkey has a long list of unresolved issues within its own borders and neighborhood, yet it positions itself as a defender of justice when it comes to Kashmir. This contradiction undermines its credibility and shows that its statements are less about principles and more about political opportunism. By highlighting these double standards, India effectively turned the spotlight back on Turkey, forcing the global community to question the sincerity of its stance. To begin with, Turkey has faced decades of criticism for its treatment of minority groups, especially the Kurds. Its handling of dissent and political opposition has also drawn global concern. Reports of media censorship, suppression of free speech, and imprisonment of journalists have become a recurring theme in international discussions on Turkey's governance. Yet, the same government that faces such accusations chooses to lecture the world's largest democracy about human rights and freedoms in Kashmir. This glaring inconsistency cannot be ignored. When a nation that struggles with its own democratic values questions another, it weakens its moral authority. Beyond domestic issues, Turkey's actions in its regional neighborhood add to the charge of hypocrisy. Its long-standing dispute over Cyprus, military interventions in Syria, and confrontational policies in the eastern Mediterranean reveal a pattern of aggressive foreign policy. These are not examples of respect for sovereignty or peaceful diplomacy. Rather, they are reminders that Turkey itself often violates the very principles it claims to defend. For Turkey to accuse India of overstepping in Kashmir while it involves itself militarily in multiple conflicts is a contradiction too large to be overlooked. India, in contrast, has consistently upheld its sovereignty without interfering in the internal affairs of other nations. This contrast was evident in Jaishankar's response. He did not simply reject Turkey's remarks, but indirectly drew attention to the fact that countries with serious internal and external challenges have little ground to comment on India's policies. The subtlety of this approach was powerful. It avoided direct confrontation yet made the hypocrisy of Turkey visible to all. Observers around the world could see the irony: a country with unresolved territorial conflicts and questionable human rights records trying to criticize India on Kashmir. This moment was also significant because it exposed how Turkey's stance was not based on genuine concern but on political alignment. By siding with Pakistan on Kashmir, Turkey attempted to strengthen its ties within the Muslim world and increase its influence. However, this opportunistic alignment backfired when India's dignified yet firm response reminded the world that credibility in diplomacy comes from consistent values, not selective criticism. Turkey's words, therefore, appeared hollow, and India's calm defense of its sovereignty stood out as a position of strength. In international politics, credibility is everything. A nation that ignores its own contradictions loses the power to influence others. By exposing Turkey's hypocrisy, India not only defended its position on Kashmir, but also reminded the world that principles like sovereignty and non-interference cannot be selectively applied. This clear exposure of double standards was a crucial part of Jaishankar's takedown, one that resonated strongly both within the UN and across global opinion. At the United Nations, India made it absolutely clear that sovereignty and non-interference are not issues open to negotiation. This was the essence of its message to Turkey and to the world at large. By responding firmly to Turkey's remarks on Kashmir, India reminded the international community of one of the most important principles of diplomacy, that every nation has the right to handle its own internal matters without outside intrusion. This message was not just about defending India's territorial integrity, but also about reinforcing the global standard that sovereignty is the foundation of peaceful international relations. India's statement was both a warning and a lesson. On one hand, it warned Turkey and other nations that attempts to interfere in India's domestic affairs will not be tolerated. On the other hand, it served as a lesson for the global stage that selective interference is dangerous. If countries begin to comment on or challenge one another's internal matters, the result would be constant conflict and instability. By standing firm, India positioned itself as a defender of order in international diplomacy, not just a nation protecting its borders. This message carried extra weight because India chose to deliver it with dignity rather than aggression. Dr. SJaishankar did not resort to heated words. Instead, he spoke with composure and authority. This style ensured that India's point was received not as an emotional reaction, but as a principled stand. By doing so, India's voice resonated far beyond the immediate exchange with Turkey. Nations listening to the debate could see that India was not merely defending itself, but also standing up for a larger principle that benefits all sovereign states. The importance of sovereignty for India cannot be overstated. Jammu and Kashmir is a region that has been a sensitive part of India's identity and politics for decades. By declaring firmly that no outside power has the right to interfere, India sent a message not just to Turkey, but also to any country that might be tempted to question its authority over the region. Sovereignty is tied to national pride, security, and stability, and India demonstrated that it will never compromise on this. This clear articulation of priorities strengthened India's global position and showed that it is a country that knows its red lines and enforces them. Moreover, this strong stand reinforced India's role as a responsible global power. At a time when many nations choose to remain vague or avoid conflict in diplomatic discussions, India's straightforward message was refreshing and effective. It reminded the world that clarity and firmness are sometimes more valuable than long speeches filled with diplomatic jargon. By asserting that sovereignty and non-interference are non-negotiable, India set a benchmark for how nations should handle attempts at external meddling. In conclusion, India's message at the UN was not just about Kashmir, but about the larger principle of international relations. It was a defense of sovereignty, a rejection of interference, and a declaration of confidence in its rightful place on the global stage. This was not simply a reply to Turkey, but a reminder to the entire world: nations can only coexist peacefully if they respect one another's boundaries. the global impact of Dr. Jaishankar's response to Turkey at the United Nations went far beyond a simple exchange of words. His reply was not just directed at Ankara, but at the wider international community, and its effects were felt across multiple layers of global diplomacy. In one powerful moment, India showcased its growing confidence as a world power capable of defending its sovereignty with clarity and composure, while also influencing how other nations perceive the balance of power in international affairs. The first major impact was on India's image. For decades, India has been seen as a responsible democracy, but often it was perceived as cautious or even hesitant. In the global arena, Jaishankar's response flipped that perception. His firm yet dignified tone projected India as a nation that is no longer defensive about its internal matters but proactive in rejecting interference. This boosted India's credibility among countries that value sovereignty and non-interference as guiding principles of international relations. Nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, many of which have faced similar challenges of external meddling, saw in India's stand an example of how to respond with confidence and strength. Another impact was the diplomatic isolation of Turkey on this issue. While Turkey tried to raise the Kashmir matter as if it were a global concern, India's calm rebuttal exposed it as an outlier with little genuine support. The absence of significant backing for Turkey's stance highlighted how most nations respect India's sovereignty and accept its consistent position on Kashmir. This isolation weakened Turkey's credibility and strengthened India's diplomatic hand. It also sent a signal to Pakistan, Turkey's close ally, that its attempts to internationalize Kashmir through sympathetic voices would not gain traction. The response also reinforced India's ties with key partners. Major powers like the United States, Russia, France, and even the European Union have long supported the idea that Kashmir is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. By addressing Turkey's interference so effectively, India reassured its allies that it would stand firm on principles they too uphold. This helped consolidate India's partnerships and reaffirmed its role as a reliable actor in global politics. Importantly, Jaishankar's words reached audiences beyond diplomatic circles. Media outlets worldwide reported on his reply, framing it as a strong and dignified counterattack. For ordinary citizens across different countries, this was a demonstration of India's rising stature. For the Indian diaspora, it was a moment of pride, reinforcing the idea that their nation's voice carries weight at the highest international forums. Such visibility contributes to soft power, giving India cultural and political influence beyond its borders. Finally, the global impact lay in the message it sent about the future of India's diplomacy. By handling the situation with restraint yet firmness, India showed that it is prepared to engage with the world on equal terms. It no longer accepts being lectured or judged by others, particularly those with weaker democratic credentials. This signals a shift towards a more assertive India, one that is confident of its place as a global leader. In essence, the global impact of Jaishankar's reply was the strengthening of India's image, the weakening of Turkey's position, and the reaffirmation of principles that are vital for world order. It was a moment that echoed far beyond the UN Hall, shaping perceptions of India as a strong, sovereign, and respected voice. In international diplomacy,